Okay, hi booktube, Aaron here. I hope you're doing okay. Today I'm going to be going through everything that I read in January, and then I'll go through some of my reading plans for February. The year's got off to a pretty good start. I've read 7 books so far. Um, Technically, well, 2 or 3 were finished early on in February. Filming this on the 2nd of February. It'll probably go up on the 3rd. But one of them was finished in the early hours, just as February 1st was beginning. And then there was another finished on the 1st of February and another that I finished today. But the bulk of the reading was done in January, so I'm going to count them as January books. And a lot of them were translated as well, which is pretty cool. The first 3 I've already covered in a reading update, so I'll try to fly through them quickly. The first was The Trial by Franz Kafka, which just has that, it's dark and depressing, but just odd and kind of funny at times. And for me, Kafka stories just have this pull. It's like you're being carried along on this sort of phantasmagoric conveyor belt. And so, yeah, really love this. And it was a great way to start off the year. I found out that this book has been banned. So there's a project in 2024 spearheaded by MJ from Reading This Life called 24 for 24 to encourage people to read more banned books. And this was banned in Nazi Germany, I think probably just because Kafka was Jewish. But it was also banned in the Soviet Union because it was defeatist, which I suppose says a lot about the book, but also a lot about the Soviet Union and what they wanted from their literature, really. The next 2 books I finished were both works of poetry, and again in translation. This is The Half-Finished Heaven, selected poems by Thomas Transtromer, translated by Robert Bly, and we've got Alphabet by Inga Christiansen, and this is translated by Susanna Nyad. Both really good. I really loved Alphabet, and both poets that I would recommend picking up if you haven't read them yet, and it seems like the kind of thing you'd like. Again, I went into a bit more detail about them in a reading update I did earlier in the month. I should say as well that the trial, this edition I read, was translated by Idris Parry as well. I'll try to remember to let you know what translations I was reading. And then next up, we've got some Dante. I've been slowly making my way through the Divine Comedy. And so in January, I finished Purgatory. So we made it up to the top of the mountain. I think this still remains my favourite part of the Divine Comedy. I think it is because in Inferno and in Paradise, people can't really change anything about themselves anymore. They can't change where they are. In when they're Inferno, they've done the things they've done, and they can't get out of it. They can't ascend any higher. And in Paradise, they are where they want to be. So there's no sense of moving towards something, whereas there is in Purgatory. So for a normal person, I suppose it's much more relatable. And then you get to the top, and that was the bit where it became much more a struggle for me when I read it the first time round. At the top of Mount Purgatory, there is the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, and it's really beautiful and calming and lush. And then there's just all this crazy imagery. There's particularly one bit that I did sort of understand this a little more with a little help of the notes and things in this edition. There's this bit, it's kind of a pastiche of some of the some of the visions, some of the imagery in the Book of Revelation, with the whore of Babylon, and is it the beast with like 7 heads and 7 crowns or something like that? And there's an image very similar to that, and it's instead of being a sort of general sort of apocalyptic thing, it's speaking really directly to the Catholic Church at the time, and I think particularly it's speaking to the fact that the papacy had moved from Rome to Avignon, and the sort of corruption of the papacy as well. And so again, you're kind of seeing a lot of religious imagery being used to speak into what was really the politics of the day. So that was quite fascinating to understand that a little more. I'm going to be taking a bit of a break with Dante. I think I was originally, I was originally reading to a schedule, but I decided to throw that out the window. I'm just going to have a little bit of breathing time before I carry on and read Paradise. So I don't know when I'll start it, but I want to just read it really slowly, because the last time I read it, I it was beautiful, and it was making me feel a lot of complicated feelings that I couldn't quite put words to. But yeah, I had absolutely no idea what was going on, and so I want to be able to take it really, really slowly, and reread bits as much as I need to, and just look up the notes and scribble things down as much as I need to, and just go really, really slowly. So I'm going to wait until it seems like the bulk of my reading is a fair bit lighter, and then I might pick this up to give it a bit more attention. And then next up, speaking of heavy books, we've got War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and this really was the bulk of my reading in January. This was a reread for me, and I just really loved reading it again. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail in this. The first time I read War and Peace, I made a video about, I think it was like 5 reasons to read War and Peace or something like that. And really my feelings about the book haven't changed that much. I feel like I understand a little bit better what's going on. Tolstoy has a very particular theory of history and how that works. It's essentially that sort of big men, great men of history, don't really matter. History is just the swarm life, the collective swarm life of humanity, and this swarm life really uses great men for their own purposes. And so, I don't know, as I understand it at the moment, there's kind of a paradox there, because in a sense, history is made up of the individual actions of loads and loads and loads of people. So that can seem empowering in a way, but also the fact that these great men are carried along by it also, it sort of throws up the question of whether an individual can actually make a difference, if that makes any sense. And so I'm not sure if I can if I completely understand what he's getting at, but I think I understand it a little bit more now. There are also just characters that I think just my relationship with them grew a little bit more, or I noticed them a little more. There's one of the soldiers called Denisov. He's a great character. He was probably one of my favourite characters this time around, even though he's not like a minor character, but he's not really one of the main characters. And also Maria, another one of she kind of becomes more of a main character as it goes on. And as well, I didn't really notice her as much the first time round. And as well, just certain scenes, I remembered, and it was just like going back to a place that you've visited, and again, noticing differences, but also just enjoying being there again and experiencing it again. This was the Louise and Alma Moore's translation, so an older translation than the one I read before. Last time I read the Pevier and Volkonsky translation, which I did slightly prefer, I think. In terms of how they treat the French, there's a lot of French in War and Peace. It's more or less treated the same, but sort of tonally, I think I did prefer what Pevier and Volkonsky were doing. I was reading this with a lovely group of people, and a lot of them were reading the Anthony Briggs translation. So the next time I read this, and it might be a good while before I decide to read it again, I might try the Briggs translation. But it really was just a joy to read War and Peace again. Mark from Book Time with Elvis was one of the sort of participants in the read, and he was saying last year he read Les Miserables, and he was sort of making comparisons. They're both very different books in many ways, but I think the way the book works on you, he found, was quite similar, I think. And so I need to read some Victor Hugo at some point. I would like to read Les Miserables. I do have Notre Dame de Paris. Well, this is Notre Dame of Paris, as it is here. So I might try and read this before I read War and Peace. Not War and Peace, Les Miserables, but we'll see how it goes. And then the last two books that I read, and these are books that were definitely read in February, but most of them, were read in January. We've got Rashomon and 17 Other Stories by Ryunosuke Akutagawa, or I think it should be Akutagawa Ryunosuke, I think they sort of swap it around in Japan with the first name and the surname. But these are just really, really good short stories. A lot of them are quite dark. There's a story in here called Hell Screen, about a painter who has to paint a Japanese screen depicting hell, but he can only paint what he's seen in real life, so he has to see all of this suffering. So it goes to some very dark places, but that's a poem that makes your eyes open a little bit wider. And a lot of my favourite stories here were stories set in sort of medieval Japan. The stories were written in the early 20th century, and so sort of history sort of catches up as you're reading through the stories. I think I did prefer the ones with a slightly earlier setting. I think my favourite story, I think it was just called The Dragon or something like that? Yeah, Dragon, the Old Potter's Tale is its name. And it's about a priest who's fed up of all his fellow priests laughing at him. And so one day he goes up to a pond and he puts up a sign that says something like, on the third day of the third month, the dragon of this pond will ascend into heaven. And no one sees him put the sign up. He doesn't admit to putting the sign up, but he just wants to play a practical joke on all the other priests who are making fun of him. But then people start taking it to heart and thinking that a dragon really will come out of this lake, that it's a holy lake with a special dragon in it. And then sort of the word spreads, but it sort of gets all out of hand and out of proportion. And I really like that story. So yeah, just some great, well crafted, well told stories. They're not always told how you'd expect as well, which is quite fun. So yeah, really great find. So I enjoyed reading those. And then the last thing I finished this month was Keats, A Brief Life in 9 Poems and 1 Epitaph by Lucasta Miller. So this is a biography of Keats, but it's done through looking at 9 of his poems and then his epitaph that's on his gravestone. And so you get the poems in, with the exception of in the second chapter. I think the second chapter is sort of an excerpt from Endymion. But then all the rest, you're getting the full poems. You've got the whole of Isabella, or the Pot of Basil. You've got the whole of the Eve of St. Agnes. You've got Ode to a Nightingale and Ode to a Grecian Urn and to Autumn and Bright Star. And it's, I suppose, they're all in chronological order, I think, of when they were written. And so you're getting the chronology of his life, and maybe certain themes are used as touchstones to look into certain areas of his life. But it's not necessarily saying that these certain conditions are why these things are in the poems. Instead, it's just using them as a springboard to explore certain areas of his life and the times he was living in, the people he was meeting. So I thought it was really, really great. It also goes into not really a full-on close reading of the poems, but a kind of discussion of the poems themselves. And so I'd say, if for anyone who's interested in Keats but hasn't read a lot of Keats, this would be a really interesting place to start, I think, because you're getting a great look into the poet, but also into the poetry. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed this. So, yeah, if you're interested in Keats but haven't read a lot, I would recommend picking it up. And that's everything that I've finished so far. There are a few things that I'm working on, so they'll be my main focuses for February. One of them is a book on my Kindle. It's a history book. I'm reading it for Historathon, and it's called the Classical World by Robin Lane Fox, which pretty much is what it says on the tin. It's a look at the Greeks and the Romans and some of the other neighbouring societies, quite often societies that they were at war with. And it's just a great overview of those societies. I've been really enjoying this. It's been my sort of go-to book to read on my commute when I'm on the train. So yeah, I'm not getting through it terribly quickly, but I'm sure I will have finished it before the end of February. And then another one I've just been kind of dipping in and out of, so I don't know how long. It might take me the whole year to read it. I might finish it by the end of February. I don't know. But it's the Diaries of Franz Kafka. And they're kind of split up into notebooks, and they really are just notebooks. It's not always a straight diary, which is really interesting. Sometimes you're getting fragments of stories. Sometimes you're getting sort of later fragments, and you're told that the bit that goes before that is in a notebook later on in this book. So you have to do a bit of hopping around. But it's been really interesting so far. And yeah, if I'm awake enough, I might try and read a bit more of that tonight. And then there are a couple of things that I definitely want to be reading in February. There's Mad Women, the poems of Gabriela Mistral, translated by Randall Couch, a poet that I'm kind of intrigued by. I've just read sort of one or two poems in anthologies, so I'll be intrigued to see what the whole book of her poetry is like. And then another reread once, now that I'm kind of in the mood at the moment for big Russian novels. It's the Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And I don't know for how long I'll be in the mood for these big Russian novels, so I thought I would strike while the iron is hot and give it a go. And it is interesting, I think, comparing Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. I think as I'm reading Tolstoy, I much prefer Tolstoy. It feels much more immersive for me. And I feel like I make deeper connections with the characters, and I do feel like I have a bit more of an idea of what he's trying to say. With Dostoevsky, once I've put the book down and I've finished it, quite often the book stays with me for much longer, and I carry on asking questions, and the scenes are replaying in my head. And so it's quite interesting that, I don't know, Dostoevsky seems to sort of stay with me more, and yet I feel like I prefer Tolstoy more. So it's an interesting relationship that I have with the two of them. But I really enjoyed the Brothers Karamazov the last time that I read it. And yeah, I'm hoping to again. This is um, the new translation by Michael Katz. I read his translation of Crime and Punishment last year and really enjoyed it. So we'll see we'll see if this is as good. And then I've just got two books to consider for February. I'm going to leave the rest of the month relatively open. 'Cause I have no idea what I'll be reading. There's Holmes is Where the Heart Is, so I'll likely be reading some Sherlock Holmes stories, and I might try and read A Study in Scarlet. I've never read that novel before, so I might try and give that a go. Um, and then a couple of possibilities. I'm not sure if I'll get to them. There's From the Holy Mountain by William Dalrymple, which is, I think, an exploration into sort of Eastern Christianity. And as you know, someone from uh, the west of Europe, it's uh, an area of Christianity that I don't know too much about. And so, yeah, I'm sure it'll be enlightening and interesting, and I'm always fascinated to find out more about Byzantium, and I think a fair bit of this will be dealing with that. And then there's the Confessions of Saint Augustine as well. So let's see if I'm not sure if it says who has translated this. I think it's quite an old translation. I borrowed this from a friend. This is translated by Edward Bouverie Pusey. But yeah, just mentioned to a friend that I'd be intrigued to read it, and he immediately lent me his copy. So I feel obliged to at least start it soon and try to get it done as quickly as I can, so I can get it back to him. But there we go. That's, I think, all I'm going to try and commit to, or even just make tentative plans towards for February. So I hope that was interesting, and I hope that your reading year has got off to a good start. But for now, I will leave it there. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.